Sarah Whitman stood on a small platform in the middle of the bridal salon, surrounded by mirrors that reflected her from every angle. The dress was ivory light as breath, fitted at the waist and falling in a soft, careful line to the floor. When she moved, the fabric followed her like something alive. She barely recognized the woman looking back at her. For a long moment, she simply stared, her hands resting at her sides, afraid that if she touched the dress, it might disappear. She had never imagined herself like this. Not as a bride. Not as someone who belonged in a place filled with polished floors, warm lighting, and quiet voices offering approval. Growing up, beauty had never been meant for her. It had always been something that existed behind glass, in magazines, on other people. Something she learned early not to want too badly. The consultant smiled and asked how she felt. Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her throat tightened without warning. She nodded instead, blinking fast. The feeling rising in her chest was too large to name. Gratitude, disbelief, fear, all tangled together. She had waited her whole life for stability, for something solid enough to stand on. Now that it was here, she did not quite trust it. As the consultant stepped back to give her space, Sarah's thoughts drifted backward, the way they always did when she was overwhelmed. She had no memory of her biological parents, no photograph, no story that softened the absence. She had been abandoned at birth, left without a name, entering the foster care system in New York before she could even open her eyes. Over the years, she moved through group homes and temporary placements, learning quickly that attachment was dangerous and promises rarely held. Childhood for Sarah had been a lesson in endurance. She learned when to stay quiet, when to protect herself, when to expect disappointment before it arrived. Joy, when it appeared, was brief and usually followed by loss. Still, she survived, and in the middle of that system, gray and unforgiving, she found the one person who made it bearable. Natalie Ford had arrived at the foster home when Sarah was 8. They were close in age, both thin, both guarded, both already older than their years. From the first night, they gravitated toward each other, two children who recognized the same wariness in the other's eyes. They shared clothes, whispered at night, and stood shoulder to shoulder when the world turned sharp. To everyone else, they were just two foster kids passing through. To each other, they were sisters. They dreamed together, quietly and stubbornly. They talked about small apartments with clean windows, about steady jobs, about coming home to someone who waited. They imagined love as safety, not excitement. Stability as the greatest luxury. When things were hardest, Natalie would squeeze Sarah's hand and tell her they would get out someday, that the system would not be the end of their story. Standing now in the bridal salon, Sarah felt the weight of those dreams pressing close. She wished Natalie were here, sitting in one of the chairs, making some dry comment that would break the tension. She wished she could turn and share this moment with the one person who had known her before she learned how to hide. Instead, she was alone with her reflection and the quiet hum of the room. She thought of Andrew, waiting patiently outside, trusting her to take her time. She loved him for that. He had never rushed her, never demanded more than she could give. With him, she felt safe in a way that still surprised her. Yet beneath the happiness, fear lingered. Sarah knew too well how quickly things could be taken away. The foster system had taught her that joy was temporary, that stability could collapse without warning. As she looked at herself in the mirror, dressed as a bride, a single thought surfaced again and again, uninvited and insistent. What if this happiness was fragile? What if, now that she finally had something beautiful, it was only a matter of time before she lost it? The memory came back to Sarah in fragments, never all at once, as if her mind still refused to hold it whole. It belonged to her adolescence, to a time when she and Natalie were still moving through the foster care system, old enough to understand their place in it, but too young to change it. That summer, the foster home organized a rare, supervised outing beyond the city. It was meant to be a reward, a break from routine. A bus carried them past familiar streets and into open space, where the air smelled different and the noise thinned. The destination was a river just outside town, wide and fast-moving, bordered by uneven banks and tall grass. For most of the kids, it felt like freedom. For Sarah, it felt unreal. She remembered standing on the shore, watching the water rush past, dark and restless. Natalie stood beside her, already barefoot, her jeans rolled up, excitement bright in her face. Neither of them were strong swimmers. In foster care, lessons like that were a luxury. Still, the water looked inviting and the day was hot. The supervisors were distracted, stretched thin, trying to keep track of too many children at once. They waded in together, laughing at first, staying close to the shallow edge. The current tugged at their legs stronger than it looked. Sarah felt it pull, felt the ground shift under her feet. She took another step, then another, wanting to prove she wasn't afraid. That was when it happened. Without warning, pain seized her leg, sharp and sudden. Her calf locked, her foot twisting uselessly beneath her. She gasped, the sound swallowed by the noise of the river. Panic rose fast, stealing her breath. She tried to call out, but her voice came out thin and broken. Natalie turned instantly. She saw Sarah's expression change, saw her flailing, her head dipping under the surface. Without hesitating, Natalie moved toward her. She grabbed Sarah's arm, bracing herself against the current. For a moment, it worked. Sarah felt herself lifted, air rushing back into her lungs as she clung desperately to Natalie's shoulder. But the river did not slow. The current surged around them, relentless. Natalie's footing slipped. Sarah felt the grip on her arm tighten, then falter. Someone on shore screamed. A supervisor ran into the water, clothes dragging her down. Natalie made one last effort. She shoved Sarah toward the surface, toward the reach of another hand. Sarah felt fingers close around her wrist, strong and urgent, pulling her free. She coughed and choked, water pouring from her mouth as she was dragged back toward safety. When she looked up again, Natalie was gone. The river carried on as if nothing had happened. Brown water rushed past, smooth and uncaring. People shouted Natalie's name. More adults entered the water, searching, scanning the surface. Sarah lay on the bank, shaking uncontrollably, her body racked with coughs and sobs she could not stop. She kept trying to sit up, to look, to see Natalie reappear, but hands held her down. Search teams were called. Divers arrived. The hours stretched, heavy and unreal. Sarah watched from a distance as they combed the river, her mind numb, refusing to accept what her eyes were telling her. Night fell. The search continued into the next day, then the next. They never found Natalie. After a week, the authorities made it official. Natalie Ford was declared dead, presumed drowned. The words sounded distant, unreal, as if they belonged to someone else's life. There was a small service, quiet and brief. Sarah stood frozen, unable to cry, unable to speak. The collapse came later. Guilt settled into Sarah like a disease. She replayed the moment endlessly, convinced that every step she had taken led Natalie closer to death. Nightmares followed. Panic attacks. Sudden silences where her thoughts vanished entirely. Eventually, the foster system did what it always did when a child became too difficult to manage. Sarah was sent to a psychiatric facility for evaluation and treatment. The medications dulled everything. Days blurred. Her body existed, but her mind stayed trapped in the river. In the moment, Natalie disappeared beneath the surface. Even after she was released, something inside her remained broken. From that point on, Sarah carried a single, unshakable belief. Natalie had died saving her. Natalie had paid for Sarah's life with her own. It became the core wound around which everything else formed. Every joy felt borrowed. Every moment of happiness came with a shadow, a quiet voice reminding her that it had been bought at too high a price. She survived. She grew older. She moved forward. But the river never truly let her go. Sarah aged out of foster care shortly after her 18th birthday, quietly and without ceremony. There were no speeches, no guidance about what came next. She was given paperwork, a list of rules, and a key to a small room arranged through social services. The building stood on the edge of Buffalo, older than it looked, its hallways dim and its walls thin. The room itself was barely furnished. A narrow bed, a chipped desk, a window that rattled when the wind came off the lake. It smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant. For the first time, the door closed behind her with no one assigned to watch over her. Freedom, she realized, did not feel the way she had imagined. It felt like standing on uneven ground, knowing that if she slipped, there would be no one to catch her. Around her, former foster kids scattered in different directions. Some drifted between couches and shelters, chasing temporary relief in alcohol or drugs. Others found themselves pulled into petty crime, shoplifting or dealing just to survive. Sarah heard stories about girls who disappeared into exploitative relationships, about boys who ended up in county jail before they were old enough to vote. She saw familiar faces change quickly, hardening, losing the cautious hope they once carried. The system released them all into the world and seemed to expect them to manage somehow. Sarah watched and learned. She felt the same pull toward numbness, toward anything that could quiet the memories and the constant tension in her chest. But the thought of ending up like the others terrified her more than the loneliness. She remembered Natalie's voice, steady and certain, telling her they would get out. Remembered the promise they had made to themselves. One evening, sitting alone in her room, Sarah made a decision. It was not dramatic. It did not come with a sense of triumph. It was simply a line she drew inside herself. She would work. She would stay away from the things that destroyed people quietly. She would survive, even if it took everything she had. The first job she found was at a modest family restaurant in Buffalo, the kind of place locals visited more than once a week. The owner needed someone reliable, someone willing to take late shifts and weekends. Sarah said yes to everything. The work was exhausting at first. She carried plates heavier than she expected, memorized menus, learned to move quickly without colliding with customers or coworkers. Tips were unpredictable, but they helped. More importantly, the job gave her structure. It was there that she met Patricia Moore. Patricia was older, her hair streaked with gray, her movements unhurried but efficient. She had worked in restaurants most of her life and treated the place like a second home. At first, she watched Sarah from a distance, noticing how she flinched at sudden noises, how her smile looked practiced rather than natural. One evening, after a customer snapped at Sarah for a mistake that wasn't hers, Patricia stepped in smoothly, diffusing the situation without raising her voice. Later, in the break room, Patricia handed Sarah a cup of coffee and told her to sit down. She did not ask questions right away. She simply talked about work, about life, about how people often took out their frustrations on the wrong targets. Over time, those conversations became a quiet routine. Patricia never pushed. She corrected Sarah gently when she froze or struggled to respond to customers. She showed her how to read people, how to keep her tone light without giving too much of herself away. She reminded her to eat, to rest, to stand up straight. Slowly, almost without noticing, Sarah began to relax. She learned how to smile without forcing it, how to make small talk that didn't feel like a lie, how to accept kindness without waiting for it to be taken back. Trust did not come easily, but it came in pieces, a shift covered without being asked, a ride home on a cold night, a simple, "You did good today," spoken like it mattered. For the first time since the river, Sarah felt herself moving out of pure survival. She was still cautious, still guarded, but something inside her began to shift. Life was no longer just about enduring the next day. It was about building something, slowly and deliberately. She was not healed, not even close, but she was standing on her own feet, and for now that was enough. Sarah met Andrew Whitman on an ordinary evening shift. One of those nights when the restaurant hummed with familiar voices and the smell of food clung to everything. He came in alone, ordered simply, and waited without impatience. When she brought his plate, he looked up and thanked her, not out of habit, but as if the words mattered. It was a small thing, but Sarah noticed it. He returned the following week, then again. Sometimes he came with a book, sometimes with nothing at all. He never rushed her, never leaned too close or asked questions that felt intrusive. When he finally asked her name, it was done carefully, like a request rather than an expectation. She told him. He told her his, and that was how it began. Their relationship grew slowly, without pressure. Andrew listened more than he spoke. He accepted pauses in conversation without trying to fill them. When Sarah hesitated, he waited. When she pulled back, he did not chase. For someone who had spent most of her life bracing for disappointment, the steadiness felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling. Andrew treated her with a quiet respect that made room for her fear instead of challenging it. He never demanded explanations for the things she could not talk about. When she flinched at loud noises or froze when plans changed suddenly, he adjusted without comment. With him, emotional safety was not a promise made out loud. It was something demonstrated again and again. As they grew closer, Andrew introduced Sarah to ordinary pleasures she had never experienced. They walked through museums on quiet afternoons, moving at her pace. They attended small theaters, sitting in the back where she felt less exposed. They wandered the city streets in the evening, hands brushing, the sound of traffic steady and predictable. These moments were simple, but to Sarah they felt extraordinary. She found herself laughing more easily, smiling without calculating how long it would last. Still, beneath the growing warmth, fear lingered. She knew her past was not something she could hide forever. Foster care, psychiatric treatment, years of instability. She waited for the moment when Andrew would decide it was too much, when the ground would give way beneath her again. That moment came, or so she thought, when he invited her to meet his parents. Andrew's family lived in a large home outside the city, set back from the road, carefully maintained but not ostentatious. Sarah's hands trembled as they drove there. She imagined questions she could not answer and judgments she could not defend against. Wealth, she had learned, often came with expectations she did not know how to meet. Andrew noticed her silence. He reached for her hand and held it steady and warm. He told her she did not have to impress anyone, that she only needed to be herself. The words helped, but they did not erase the years of conditioning that told her to prepare for rejection. The evening surprised her. Andrew's parents welcomed her without ceremony. They were well-dressed but understated, their manners direct and unpretentious. His mother asked about Sarah's work, genuinely curious. His father spoke about his own upbringing, about building stability through effort rather than inheritance. There were no probing questions about her past, no subtle tests of worth. When Sarah offered to help clear the table, Andrew's mother smiled and handed her a towel. They worked side by side, talking easily. There was no division between host and guest, no sense that Sarah needed to earn her place. By the end of the night, something inside Sarah loosened. Acceptance came without conditions, without judgment. It felt almost dangerous to trust it. Andrew proposed months later, quietly, without spectacle. He chose a moment when they were alone, when there was no audience to perform for. He told her he loved her. He told her he wanted a life built together, carefully and honestly. Sarah said yes through tears, joy and fear woven tightly together. Happiness followed, real and tangible. Yet, even as she planned a wedding, even as she allowed herself to hope, Sarah carried her insecurity with her. She knew too well how quickly things could change. And though she trusted Andrew, she still waited, somewhere deep inside, for the other shoe to drop. The wedding day arrived clear and cool, the kind of buffalo morning that carried the promise of calm before the wind off the lake changed its mind. Sarah Whitman stood beside Andrew at the courthouse steps, the stone beneath her shoes solid and real, grounding her as the doors opened behind them. Applause rose from family and friends gathered nearby, brief and warm, echoing against the building's facade. For a moment, everything felt suspended. The city noise softened. Sarah became acutely aware of Andrew's hand around hers, steady and sure. The ring on her finger caught the light, a small flash that made her heart skip. She smiled, letting herself believe that this moment was hers to keep. They moved together toward the waiting motorcade, a modest line of cars decorated with simple ribbons and flowers. The photographer called out directions, laughter followed, and someone adjusted Sarah's veil as she stepped forward. The world felt carefully arranged, each piece falling into place exactly where it belonged. Then, just as Sarah reached the open door of the car, a soft knock sounded against the window. She turned, surprised. Outside stood a little girl, no more than 7, thin to the point that her coat hung loosely on her shoulders. Her shoes were worn, the toes scuffed pale. In her small hands, she held a bouquet of daisies, the stems tied together with a narrow ribbon. The flowers were fresh, bright against the gray of the sidewalk. "Ma'am," the girl said quietly, her voice hesitant but practiced. "Would you like to buy some flowers? They're for good luck." Something in her tone made Sarah pause. She looked down at the child, taking in the careful way she stood, the seriousness in her eyes. Without thinking, Sarah reached for her purse and handed over a bill, taking the bouquet gently. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice soft. "They're beautiful." As the girl smiled and stepped back, Sarah's gaze lingered on her longer than she intended. It was then that she noticed the girl's hair. 2 braids ran neatly along either side of the child's head, woven with precision and care. The pattern was intricate, not the simple braiding Sarah saw every day. The strands crossed in a specific way, tight at the scalp, loosening only at the ends. Sarah felt a jolt of recognition, so sharp it made her dizzy. She knew that braid. Her breath caught as the memory surfaced, without warning. Natalie's hands, quick and sure, moving through hair with the same exact technique. Natalie teaching her how to keep the tension just right, how to weave without pulling too hard. No one else had ever braided hair that way. No one Sarah had known anyway. The world tilted slightly before she could stop herself. Sarah stepped away from the car and called out to the girl. "Hey," she said gently, "what's your name?" The girl hesitated, then answered, "Mia. Mia Ford." "How old are you, Mia?" 7, the girl replied. Sarah nodded, her pulse pounding in her ears. "And why are you selling flowers today?" Mia shifted her weight, glancing toward the street as if checking how much time she had. "My mom is very sick," she said. "She needs surgery. I'm trying to help." The word surgery echoed in Sarah's head, hollow and heavy. "What's your mom's name?" Sarah asked, already fearing the answer. Mia looked back at her, her expression earnest. "Natalie," she said. "Natalie Ford." The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her hand tightened around the bouquet, the stems pressing into her palm. For a moment, she could not speak. The sounds of the city rushed back and around her, too loud, too close. Laughter from behind her felt distant, unreal. "I'm sorry," Sarah managed finally. Is she very ill?" Mia nodded. "She's in the hospital a lot. I sell flowers when I can. I want her to get better." Sarah swallowed hard. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. Natalie Ford. The braids. The coincidence was too precise to ignore and too impossible to accept. Andrew appeared at her side, concern flickering across his face. "Sarah," he asked quietly, Is everything all right? She turned to him, her expression shaken, words failing her. I don't know, she said truthfully. Mia took a step back, clutching her empty hands together. Thank you for buying the flowers, she said, already retreating toward the sidewalk. Sarah watched her go, the small figure moving away, blending into the city as if she had never been there at all. The bouquet trembled slightly in Sarah's grasp as she finally got into the car beside Andrew. The daisies resting in her lap, a deep unease settled over her. The joy of the moment had not vanished, but it had cracked, letting something dark and unresolved seep through. Sarah leaned back against the seat, her thoughts tangled and racing. She did not yet know why, but she was certain of one thing. The past had found her again. Days passed after the wedding, but the image of the girl with the daisies refused to fade. Sarah carried it with her through quiet mornings and restless nights, through conversations that drifted without landing. Andrew noticed the distraction and did not press her. When Sarah finally told him she wanted to check on the child from the courthouse, he agreed without hesitation. They drove through a neighborhood Sarah did not know well. Blocks of older houses pressed close together, paint peeling in places where time had been allowed to linger. The address Mia had given her led to a narrow home set slightly back from the street. A small yard sat out front, the grass uneven. A plastic chair tipped on its side near the steps. Sarah knocked. No one answered. She knocked again, louder this time. From somewhere inside, a dog barked, sharp and anxious. A moment later, a door across the yard opened and an elderly woman stepped out, pulling a cardigan tighter around herself as she looked over. You looking for Natalie? The woman asked before Sarah could speak. Yes, Sarah replied, her stomach tightening. I'm here to see her daughter, Mia. The woman's expression softened. Poor thing. She's with me right now. Natalie got worse last night. They took her by ambulance to the county hospital early this morning. The words landed heavily. She's very sick? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. The woman nodded. Cancer. Late stage. Doctors said there wasn't much they could do anymore. Sarah thanked her, gave her name, and promised she would come back. She returned to the car feeling unsteady, the air suddenly too thin. Andrew was already turning the engine over as she sat down. She's at the public hospital, Sarah said quietly. They took her this morning. They did not speak as they drove. The streets blurred past, familiar landmarks taking on an unfamiliar edge. Sarah's thoughts raced ahead, colliding with memories she could not organize. Natalie, the river, the braids, the name. Every piece felt close enough to touch, yet impossible to hold together. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights were unforgiving. The waiting area smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. Sarah approached the reception desk, her voice shaking despite her effort to steady it. I'm looking for Natalie Ford, she said. She was brought in earlier today. The clerk typed for a moment, then looked up, her expression shifting. I'm sorry, she said gently. She passed away this morning. The sentence felt unreal, as if it belonged to someone else's life. Sarah stood frozen, her ears ringing. Andrew's hand found her back, firm and grounding. I need to see her, Sarah said finally, the words forced out of her chest. Please, I think I knew her. The clerk hesitated, then nodded. I'll ask a nurse. They waited in silence until a nurse appeared, her movements efficient, her face kind but tired. She led Sarah down a hallway that seemed too long, too bright. Each step felt heavy, as though Sarah were walking against a current. In a small, quiet room, a body lay beneath a sheet. Sarah stood at the foot of the bed, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it could be heard. She took a breath, then another, and reached for the edge of the sheet. Her hands trembled as she pulled it back. The face beneath was thin, pale, unfamiliar. It was not Natalie. The shock came first, sharp and disorienting. Then relief surged through her, so suddenly it made her knees weak. Natalie had not died here. Natalie was not this woman. The thought broke through like air after being underwater too long. Almost immediately, horror followed. The woman on the bed was someone else's mother. Mia's mother. A stranger whose life had ended quietly, without fanfare, leaving behind a child who would never come home to her again. Sarah covered her mouth, tears spilling before she could stop them. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she did not know to whom. The nurse waited respectfully, then spoke. There were no family members listed. "Are you able to take her belongings?" Sarah nodded numbly. She followed the nurse back to the desk, where a small bag was placed in her hands. Inside were a watch, a simple pendant, and a folded piece of paper. The note was written in uneven handwriting, the ink slightly smudged. Sarah did not read it there. She carried it out to a quiet corner of the waiting area and sat down. Andrew stood nearby, his presence steady, protective. When Sarah unfolded the paper and began to read, the room seemed to disappear. The letter was addressed to Mia. It was short, written with effort, every word deliberate. The woman apologized for not being strong enough, promised love beyond measure, urged her daughter to study hard, to be kind, to live fully. She told Mia that she was her greatest joy, her reason for holding on as long as she had. Sarah's chest tightened painfully as she reached the end. Tears blurred the words, but she read them again anyway, as if repetition might make the loss less final. She folded the note carefully, pressing it back into the bag. In that moment, the full weight of what had happened settled over her. Mia was alone. No mother, no father, no one to stand between her and the system Sarah knew too well. The realization struck deep, awakening memories Sarah had spent years trying to contain. She closed her eyes, drawing a slow breath. Whatever doubts she had carried, whatever fear still lived inside her, one thing was suddenly clear. She could not walk away from this. Sarah told Andrew everything that evening, sitting across from him at the kitchen table while the city lights glowed faintly through the window. She spoke slowly, carefully, as if the truth might break if she rushed it. She told him about the visit to Mia's home, the hospital, the woman who was not Natalie, and the letter written in uneven ink for a 7-year-old girl who would never read it in her mother's voice. Andrew listened without interrupting. When she finished, her hands were clenched in her lap, her shoulders tense, waiting for a response she feared might change everything. Andrew reached across the table and took her hands. "We'll take care of it," he said simply. "The funeral, the arrangements, whatever needs to be done." Sarah searched his face, looking for hesitation, for calculation. There was none. The relief that washed over her was immediate and overwhelming. The funeral took place 2 days later. It was small and quiet, held in a modest chapel near the neighborhood where Mia lived. A few neighbors attended, along with an older woman who had watched Mia while her mother was ill. There were no speeches, no elaborate displays, just flowers, soft hymns, and a simple casket that rested at the front of the room. Sarah stood near Mia throughout the service, close enough to feel the slight tremor in the girl's body. Mia did not cry at first. She stared straight ahead, her small hands folded tightly together, her face composed in a way that made Sarah's chest ache. It was the same expression Sarah had worn years ago, the one children learned when they realized no one else could carry the weight for them. After the service, as people filtered out quietly, Sarah knelt in front of Mia and met her eyes. "We need to talk," she said gently, "about your mom." Mia studied her for a long moment, then nodded. They sat together on a bench outside the chapel, the air cool and still. "I know she's gone," Mia said quietly before Sarah could speak. "I knew before you came to see her. I heard the doctors talking. Mom tried not to let me know, but I did." Sarah's breath caught. "I'm so sorry," she said. I should have told you sooner. Mia shook her head. It's okay. You told me the truth when it mattered. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a thick envelope, worn at the edges. She held it out towards Sarah. This is the money I saved, she said, for her surgery. I want you to use it for the funeral. Please. Sarah stared at the envelope, stunned. Mia, I can't take that from you. You have to, Mia insisted, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. Mom would want it that way. I don't need it anymore. Sarah wrapped her arms around the girl, holding her close as Mia finally broke, her small body shaking as sobs spilled free. Sarah felt the weight of that trust settle onto her shoulders, heavy and sacred. Later that evening, after Mia was settled temporarily with the neighbor, Sarah and Andrew talked again. This time, there was no hesitation in Sarah's voice. She can't go into foster care, Sarah said. I won't let that happen. Andrew nodded. Then she won't, he replied. We'll do this the right way. The paperwork began quickly. Emergency placement meetings with social services, background checks. It was all familiar to Sarah in a way she never wanted it to be. Mia moved into their home, quietly, carrying her backpack and a small bag of clothes. She stayed close to the walls at first, watching, listening, learning the rhythms of the house. The adjustment was not easy. Mia cried at night, muffling the sound into her pillow. She kept her belongings neatly packed, as if ready to leave at any moment. Sarah recognized the behavior instantly. It was survival, not mistrust. Andrew approached her with patience. He never raised his voice. He let Mia set the pace, offering help without forcing closeness. Slowly, routines formed. Breakfast at the same time every morning. Homework at the kitchen table. Walks around the block in the evening. One night, weeks later, Sarah was washing dishes when she heard footsteps behind her. Mia stood in the doorway, twisting the hem of her shirt nervously. Can you tell Andrew dinner is ready? She asked. Sarah smiled. Of course. Mia hesitated, then added softly, Dad. Tell Dad dinner is ready. The word hung in the air, fragile and unexpected. Andrew froze for a moment when Sarah passed the message along. Then he knelt in front of Mia, his voice unsteady. You don't have to call me that, he said gently. Only if you want to. Mia nodded. I want to. Sarah turned away, pressing her hand to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. In that moment, she knew the decision they had made was no longer just an act of compassion. It was the beginning of a family. Months passed, and life began to find a steadier rhythm. The house settled into routines that no longer felt temporary. Mia went to school each morning with her backpack zipped and ready, returning in the afternoons with stories about classmates and assignments spread across the kitchen table. Sarah returned to work with a sense of purpose that had deepened, and Andrew adjusted his schedule to be home earlier whenever he could. Grief still lived in the quiet corners of the house, but it no longer dominated every breath. Yet one detail refused to release its hold on Sarah's mind. The braids. She saw them everywhere now, or thought she did. In reflections, in passing strangers, in moments when her thoughts drifted. The precise way the strands crossed. The careful tension at the scalp. The deliberate looseness at the ends. It was not a common style. Sarah had tried, more than once, to dismiss the memory as coincidence, but something inside her would not let it rest. One morning, as Sarah helped Mia get ready for school, she watched the girl sit patiently while Sarah smoothed her hair. The familiarity of the motion stirred something old and restless. Your mom braided hair beautifully, Sarah said carefully. Where did she learn to do it like that? Mia shrugged at first, then thought for a moment. From her friend, she replied. They worked together. Sarah's hand stilled. What was her friend's name? Natalie, Mia said, as if it were obvious. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Sarah forced herself to breathe evenly. Did you know her well? Mia nodded. She used to come over sometimes after work. She taught Mom how to do different hairstyles. She was really nice to me. She always brought candy. Sarah swallowed. What happened to her? Mia hesitated, then spoke quietly. She got arrested. It was a long time ago. The word struck hard. Arrested? Sarah asked. For what? They said she stole money, Mia answered. From the store where they worked. Mom said she didn't do it, but nobody listened. She went to prison. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. The pieces began to align in her mind, slow and deliberate. Natalie, the braids, the conviction, the timing. A possibility she had buried years ago rose sharply to the surface. Natalie, Sarah repeated softly. Do you remember her last name? Mia nodded again. Ford. Natalie Ford. The certainty of it left Sarah momentarily speechless. She turned away under the pretense of finding a hair tie, her thoughts racing. Natalie Ford. The name she had mourned. The name she believed belonged to a girl taken by the river. Alive. The realization settled heavily, accompanied by a rush of conflicting emotion. Hope flared, immediate and dangerous. Guilt followed close behind, tightening her chest. If Natalie was alive, then everything Sarah believed about that day, about her own survival, had been incomplete. That evening, after Mia was asleep, Sarah told Andrew what she had learned. She spoke slowly, laying out each detail as clearly as she could. The braids, the name, the arrest. Andrew listened intently. When she finished, he did not dismiss the idea or urge caution. He considered it for a moment, then nodded. I can look into it, he said. There are public records. If she was convicted in New York State, there will be something. Sarah watched him closely. You think it's possible? I think it's worth checking, Andrew replied. If there's even a chance she's alive. You deserve to know. The next few days stretched painfully. Andrew made calls, reached out to contacts who knew how to navigate the system efficiently. Sarah tried to distract herself with work, with caring for Mia, but her thoughts remained fixed on the same point. Finally, one evening, Andrew came home with a file in his hand. His expression was serious but steady. I found her, he said. Sarah's breath caught. Where? Albion Correctional Facility, Andrew replied. Natalie Ford, incarcerated for felony theft. She's still there. The room fell silent. Sarah sank into a chair, the weight of the confirmation pressing down on her. Natalie was alive, not lost to the river, not erased by time, but held behind concrete walls and locked doors. The braids had been telling the truth all along. The drive to Albion Correctional Facility took longer than Sarah expected, each mile stretching her nerves tighter. The landscape shifted from familiar streets to quieter roads, then to long, open stretches where her thoughts had too much room to move. She barely spoke, her hands folded together in her lap, her mind replaying the same question over and over again. What if she was wrong? The prison rose from the distance, like a block of gray certainty, unwelcoming and final. Sarah followed the procedures mechanically, handing over identification, passing through metal detectors, obeying instructions without argument. Her heart pounded so loudly she wondered if the guards could hear it. She was led into a visitation room lined with tables bolted to the floor. The air was stale, heavy with unspoken stories. Sarah sat down and waited, her eyes fixed on the door. When it opened, she almost didn't recognize the woman who stepped inside. Natalie Ford was thinner, her posture guarded, her hair pulled back simply beneath institutional rules. The years had altered her face, sharpened it, etched lines where laughter once lived. For a brief second, they stared at each other in disbelief, as if both were afraid the other might vanish. Then Natalie's eyes widened. Sarah, she whispered. The sound of her name broke something loose. Sarah stood, so quickly her chair scraped the floor. They closed the distance between them in a rush of movement, arms wrapping tightly, clinging as if the world might pull them apart again. Tears came freely, unchecked, years of grief and confusion pouring out at once. "I thought you were dead," Sarah sobbed. "They told us you drowned. We buried you." Natalie held her just as tightly, her own shoulders shaking. "I tried to come back," she said. "I didn't know how." When they finally sat down, still holding each other's hands across the table, Natalie began to speak. Her voice was steady, but the story itself was anything but. She remembered the river clearly, the moment she pushed Sarah toward safety, the strength leaving her body as the current took hold. She was pulled under, dragged far downstream, losing consciousness as the water filled her lungs. She woke days later in a small, isolated home, coughing and feverish, watched over by an elderly fisherman and his wife. They had found her tangled near the bank, barely alive. They lived far from town, off the grid in many ways. Natalie had no identification, no memory of her past beyond fragments. By the time she recovered, weeks had passed. When she tried to leave, the couple discouraged her, fearful she would be taken away. They believed she had been sent to them for a reason. Exhausted, confused, and without resources, Natalie stayed. She grew up in isolation, finished school late, and eventually left to find work. The world she returned to felt harsher than the one she remembered. Jobs were scarce, stability fragile. She took a position at a small retail business, grateful for the income. That was where everything fell apart. Her employer, Frank Donnelly, noticed her quickly. His attention turned into pressure, his comments into demands. When Natalie refused his advances, his demeanor changed. The friendliness vanished. The threats came quietly at first, then openly. Not long after, a large sum of money disappeared from the store. Police were called. Natalie was accused. She denied it, but the cash was found in her bag, planted there without her knowledge. Her word meant nothing against his. The trial moved quickly. She was convicted of felony theft and sentenced. "I kept thinking," Natalie said softly, "that if I just told the truth enough times, someone would listen." No one did. Sarah listened, her hands trembling, anger rising with every word. "I knew it," she said. "I knew you wouldn't do something like that." When Sarah told Natalie about Mia, about the woman she had worked with, about the braids and the daisies, Natalie's face crumpled. She covered her mouth, tears spilling over. "She was good," Natalie whispered. "She didn't deserve that." Andrew's involvement began immediately. Through contacts and persistence, he arranged for a lawyer to review Natalie's case. It took time, weeks of digging through old files and transcripts. Then a break came from an unexpected place. A former cleaning staff member from the store came forward. She had seen Frank Donnelly slip the money into Natalie's bag on the night of the theft. Fear had kept her silent for years. Retirement finally freed her. With her testimony, the case reopened. Sarah attended every hearing she could. Natalie stood straighter with each appearance, hope returning cautiously, afraid to settle too deeply. When the verdict was overturned and Natalie was formally exonerated, the moment felt unreal. She walked out of the facility, carrying a small box of belongings, free for the first time in years. Frank Donnelly was arrested months later, charged with multiple offenses tied to similar accusations against other women. His business collapsed under investigation. His name became one people avoided. Sarah stood beside Natalie as they left the courthouse. The past no longer a closed door, but something they had finally faced together. Natalie had survived the river. Now she was finally free. Natalie stayed with Sarah and Andrew at first, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because the space allowed her to breathe. Freedom, she learned quickly, was not something the body accepted all at once. Doors that were not locked still startled her. Silence felt too large. At night, she woke before dawn, convinced she had missed a count or a bell that no longer existed. Sarah understood without explanation. She gave Natalie the guest room at the end of the hall, a place with a window that caught the morning light. No one asked questions. No one hovered. The house simply made room for her. Andrew handled the practical things quietly and efficiently. He helped Natalie replace lost identification, open a bank account, and apply for work. A small apartment became available within weeks, close enough for visits, but far enough to feel like a beginning. Until then, Natalie stayed, finding her footing one ordinary day at a time. Work came next. Andrew introduced Natalie to a colleague who managed a logistics office looking for a coordinator. The position required attention to detail and reliability, not credentials she didn't have. Natalie took the job seriously, arriving early, staying late, grateful for the chance to prove herself without suspicion, following every step. Slowly, confidence returned. The way she spoke changed. The way she held herself did too. Mia watched all of it with quiet fascination. She spent afternoons with Natalie doing homework at the dining table, asking careful questions about the world beyond their street. Natalie answered honestly, never oversharing, never pretending pain hadn't existed. Trust grew naturally between them, rooted in shared understanding rather than forced cheer. Months passed. It happened at a neighborhood gathering Andrew hosted for colleagues and friends. A simple backyard dinner meant to mark the end of summer. Natalie arrived late, unsure she belonged, but Sarah waved her in with a smile that needed no words. That was where Natalie met Lucas Reed. Lucas was unremarkable at first glance in the way that proved meaningful later. He was kind without performance, attentive without intrusion. He worked in software development, spoke thoughtfully, listened more than he talked. When he laughed, it came easily without bitterness. They spoke that night about small things. Books, music, the weather shifting earlier each year. There was no rush, no attempt to impress. When the evening ended, Lucas asked if he could call her sometime. Natalie hesitated, then nodded. Learning to trust love was slower than learning to trust safety. Natalie canceled their second meeting twice before finally showing up the third time, apologizing unnecessarily. Lucas did not push. He waited. Over time, the space between them filled with routine. Coffee after work, walks through the park, shared dinners that felt almost domestic before either of them named it. The night Natalie realized she was pregnant, she sat alone in her apartment, staring at the test in disbelief. Fear came first, then confusion. Finally, something like cautious hope. She told Lucas the next morning, braced for disappointment or distance. Instead, he listened, then took her hands. "We'll figure this out," he said. "Together." Not long after, Sarah stood in her own bathroom holding a similar test, her heart pounding with the recognition of possibility. When she told Andrew, he laughed once in disbelief, then pulled her into an embrace that lingered. The joy was quiet, private, earned. Telling Mia required more thought than either of them expected. Sarah and Andrew rehearsed what to say, how to reassure her, how to leave no space for doubt. Mia listened, her face serious as always. When they finished, she nodded. "That's good," she said simply. "I'll help." Andrew laughed. "Help with what?" "Everything," Mia replied. "Babies need a lot." The certainty in her voice eased something in Sarah she hadn't realized was still tense. Mia was not afraid of being replaced. She was ready to be included. As Natalie's pregnancy progressed alongside Sarah's, the parallel felt unreal. Two women once defined by absence, now preparing for new life within a home that had chosen them both. Evenings became quieter, softer. Conversations turned toward names, plans, the shape of things to come. Natalie often sat on the porch at dusk, watching the light fade, reflecting on the improbable path that had led her there. The river, the silence, the years that had tried to erase her. All of it felt distant now, not forgotten, but finally placed where it belonged. Injustice had marked their beginnings. Survival had shaped their youth, but what remained was not bitterness. It was something steadier. Family, chosen and built deliberately. On an autumn afternoon, Sarah watched Mia help Natalie braid her hair, the familiar pattern passing from one set of hands to another. The motion was careful, respectful, preserving something without clinging to pain. Sarah felt the weight of memory ease, replaced by continuity rather than loss. That evening, as the house settled and the world outside grew quiet, Sarah stood at the window, one hand resting on her stomach. Andrew joined her, their shoulders touching. There was no need to speak. What had been broken had not been restored to its original form. It had been remade, and in the quiet that followed, there was peace, not loud or triumphant, but real, lasting, and earned.